The iron collar was cold against Elias's throat. He stood on the raised platform in the grand marketplace of Astoria, hands bound behind his back, trying to maintain the last shreds of his dignity as hundreds of eyes raked over him. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square, listing his attributes like he was livestock. 22 years old, unclaimed Omega, educated, no previous bonds, excellent health, rare silver hair. Elias had stopped listening. Instead, he focused on the mathematics problem he'd been solving in his head for the past 3 hours. Anything to distance himself from the reality that his life as he knew it was over. 6 months ago, he'd been a university student studying astrophysics. Then his father's gambling debts had caught up with their family, and the creditors had come calling. In the empire of Astoria, debts could be paid in many ways. For an Omega from a fallen noble house, there was only one option that would settle the astronomical sum. Sale. We'll start the bidding at 5,000 gold crowns, the auctioneer announced. The crowd stirred. That was already more than most Omegas fetched. Elias's education and noble lineage, despite his family's disgrace, still held value. He heard the bids rising 6,000, 7,000, 8,000. Each number was another chain binding him to a future he'd never wanted. Then a voice cut through the marketplace like a blade through silk. 100,000 gold crowns. The entire square fell silent. Elias's head snapped up, searching for the source of that voice. Deep, resonant, with an undertone of absolute authority that made his Omega instincts shiver despite his best efforts to suppress them. There, at the back of the crowd, stood a man who could only be an alpha of significant power. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with jet-black hair pulled back in a half-knot that revealed a sharp, aristocratic face. He wore the black and crimson uniform of the Imperial Guard, but the golden epaulets on his shoulders marked him as something more. Commander, at least. His eyes, even from this distance, seemed to glow with an amber light. The auctioneer stammered. "Yes, sir. Did you say? 100,000 gold crowns." The man repeated, his gaze locked on Elias. "Do I need to repeat myself a third time?" "And no, Commander. Sold. The Omega is sold to Commander Cassian Blackthorn of the Imperial Guard." Elias's legs nearly gave out. Cassian Blackthorn. Everyone in Astoria knew that name. The Emperor's right hand, the most decorated soldier in the Empire's history. The Alpha who had single-handedly turned the tide in the border wars 3 years ago. Ruthless, brilliant, and utterly untouchable. And apparently now Elias's owner. Within minutes, the transaction was complete. Elias found himself in an elegant black carriage bearing the imperial seal, sitting across from the man who had just purchased him like a piece of furniture. Cassian hadn't spoken since they'd left the marketplace. He simply watched Elias with those unsettling amber eyes, his expression unreadable. Finally, Elias couldn't bear the silence anymore. "Why?" he asked, hating how his voice trembled slightly. "Why what?" Cassian's voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made him more intimidating. "Why pay 100,000 gold crowns for me? You could have bought 10 Omegas for that price." "You could have." "I don't want 10 Omegas," Cassian interrupted. "I want you." Elias's breath caught. "You don't even know me." A slight smile curved Cassian's lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I know you were studying astrophysics at the Imperial University. I know you published a paper last year on celestial navigation that impressed the royal astronomers. I know you speak 4 languages, play the violin, and once punched a duke's son for harassing a beta servant." Elias stared at him, blood draining from his face. "You've been watching me? I make it my business to know everything that happens in this empire," Cassian said. "When I heard that Lord Ashford's son was being sold to settle debts, I decided to intervene." "Intervene?" Elias laughed bitterly. "You bought me. That's not intervention, that's ownership." "Would you have preferred one of the others bidding on you?" Cassian asked, and there was an edge to his voice now. "Lord Marrow, who's gone through 7 Omegas in the past 5 years, all of whom disappeared under mysterious circumstances? Or perhaps Duke Valemont, who keeps his Omegas locked in the west tower of his estate, never to be seen in public again. Elias fell silent. He'd recognized some of those names in the crowd, had felt sick knowing any of them might claim him. I thought not, Cassian continued. My estate has strict rules, Elias Ashford. You will be treated with respect. You will not be confined unless you prove dangerous. You will have access to books, music, and whatever educational materials you desire. In return, I ask only that you fulfill the basic duties of an Omega in an Alpha's household. And what duties are those? Elias asked, though he was afraid he knew the answer. Cassian's gaze intensified. You will manage my household affairs, as I'm often away on military matters. You will accompany me to social functions when required. And when your heat comes. He paused, and Elias saw something flicker in those amber eyes. We will discuss arrangements that are acceptable to both of us. Both of us? Elias repeated incredulously. I'm your property. Since when does property get a say? Since I decided it does, Cassian said firmly. I may have bought you, Elias, but I have no interest in forcing myself on an unwilling Omega. Whatever you may think of me, I'm not a monster. Elias wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all, but he was exhausted. The carriage had entered a wealthy district of the capital, passing mansions and estates that spoke of old money and older power. Finally, they stopped before a sprawling compound surrounded by high stone walls. Welcome to Blackthorn Manor, Cassian said as the carriage door opened. Your new home. Blackthorn Manor was nothing like Elias had expected. Yes, it was enormous. A sprawling estate with formal gardens, training grounds for soldiers, and a main house that could easily accommodate 100 people. But it wasn't cold or imposing. The staff who greeted them were professional but kind, and more surprising, several of them were Omegas who moved about freely, without collars or signs of subservience. An older beta woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Helena, the head housekeeper, showed Elias to his rooms. Not a cell, not a servant's quarters, but an actual suite on the second floor with a bedroom, a private study, and a bathroom with a marble tub large enough to swim in. Commander Blackthorn had these prepared for you specifically, Mrs. Helena said, gesturing to the bookshelves that lined one wall. He requested texts on astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy. If there's anything else you need, you have only to ask. Elias ran his fingers along the spines of the books, recognizing some of the titles as ones he'd had to sell when his family's fortunes collapsed. I don't understand, he murmured. Why is he doing this? Mrs. Helena's expression softened. The commander is not what people think, young master. Give him a chance. Over the following days, Elias discovered that life at Blackthorn Manor was surreal in its normalcy. He was expected to rise at a reasonable hour, take meals in the formal dining room, and familiarize himself with the household operations. Cassian was often absent. Military duties called him to the palace or the training grounds, but when they did cross paths, he was unfailingly polite and distant. It was driving Elias mad. He'd expected demands, expectations, the typical alpha posturing he'd seen all his life. Instead, Cassian treated him like a guest, not a possession. They shared meals in relative silence, with Cassian occasionally asking about Elias's studies or opinions on current events. The commander seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts, which was so far outside Elias's experience with alphas that he didn't know how to respond. A week after his arrival, Elias was working through a complex mathematical proof in his study when a knock came at the door. Come in, he called absently, not looking up from his papers. You're still working at this hour? Elias's head snapped up. Cassian stood in the doorway, still in his military uniform but looking more exhausted than Elias had yet seen him. It was nearly midnight. I could say the same to you, Elias replied. Shouldn't the Emperor's commander be resting? A ghost of a smile crossed Cassian's face. Should, yes. Do, rarely. He moved into the room, and Elias caught the scent of him. Pine and smoke and something darker. Something that made his Omega instincts perk up despite himself. May I? He was gesturing to the chair across from Elias's desk. Asking permission. In his own house. It's your manor, Elias said, trying to keep his voice neutral. It's your study, Cassian countered, but he sat down anyway, his large frame making the elegant chair look almost delicate. What are you working on? Elias hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than pretense. I'm trying to solve the meridian paradox. It's a problem in celestial mechanics that's been bothering astronomers for decades. Cassian leaned forward, genuine interest in his eyes. The one about planetary orbits not aligning with classical predictions? Elias blinked. You know about the meridian paradox? I studied engineering at the Imperial Academy, Cassian said. Before I joined the military, celestial navigation was required coursework. He paused, studying the equations scattered across Elias's desk. You're approaching it from a gravitational perspective. Interesting. For the next hour, they discussed mathematics and astronomy, and Elias found himself forgetting that this was his owner, the man who had purchased him. Cassian was brilliant, his mind sharp and quick, able to follow Elias's most complex reasoning and offer insights that made Elias see problems in new ways. You should have been a scholar, Elias said finally. Not a soldier. Something dark flickered across Cassian's face. We don't always get to choose our paths. No, Elias agreed quietly. We don't. Silence stretched between them, but it was different now. Less empty, more loaded. Elias, Cassian said finally, and it was the first time he'd used Elias's given name without the formal honorific. I need to tell you something. About why I really bought you. Elias's stomach tightened. Here it comes, he thought. The truth. The real demands. I'm being pressured to take a mate, Cassian continued, his voice carefully controlled. The Emperor believes that, as his commander, I should set an example of proper alpha conduct. Establish a household, produce heirs, contribute to the Empire's strength. And you don't want that, Elias guessed. I don't want what they want, Cassian clarified. The Emperor's advisors have been parading Omegas from noble houses in front of me for 2 years. All of them perfectly bred, perfectly trained, perfect little dolls who would smile and nod and never question anything. And you wanted something different? Elias said slowly, beginning to understand. I wanted someone with a mind, Cassian said, his amber eyes intense. Someone who would challenge me, who had dreams beyond being some alpha's ornament. When I heard about you, your intelligence, your spirit, the way you'd fought to continue your education even as your family fell apart, I knew. Knew what? That you were someone worth saving. Cassian stood, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens. I made you a promise in the carriage, Elias. I told you I wouldn't force you. I meant it. But I need you to understand the situation we're both in. The Emperor expects me to bond an Omega. If I refuse outright, he'll start questioning my loyalty. In the current political climate, that could be dangerous for both of us. Elias's mind raced. So you want me to pretend? To act as your bonded mate in public? I'm asking if you would consider it, Cassian said. You would have complete autonomy in private. Your own rooms, your own life, your studies. I would never touch you without your explicit consent. In public, we would maintain the appearance of a proper Alpha-Omega pair. In return, you'd have safety, resources, and freedom that you could never have at anyone else's estate. And if I refuse? Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. Then I'll find you a position somewhere safe, away from the capital. A teaching post, perhaps, at one of the provincial universities. You'd be free. Cassian turned back to face him. But you'd also be vulnerable. Your father's creditors could come for you again. Other alphas might decide they want what I've already claimed. I can protect you here, Elias. I can give you the life you deserve. It was, Elias realized, probably the best offer he was going to get. And despite everything, despite his fears and his pride and his anger at the world that had brought him to this point, he found himself wanting to say yes. Not just because of the practical benefits, but because something in him responded to Cassian Blackthorn in a way he'd never responded to any alpha before. I have conditions, Elias heard himself say. Cassian's expression didn't change, but Elias saw relief flash in his eyes. Name them. I continue my studies. I want access to the Imperial Observatory and the university libraries. I want to publish my research under my own name, not hidden behind yours. Agreed. I manage my own schedule. I won't be at your beck and call. Agreed. And, Elias took a breath. When my heat comes, I use suppressants. I'm not ready for anything else. This time, Cassian hesitated. Suppressants are dangerous if used long-term. That's my choice to make, Elias said firmly. After a long moment, Cassian nodded. Agreed. But if they start affecting your health, we discuss alternatives. Alternatives that don't involve bonding, Elias insisted. Alternatives that you consent to, Cassian corrected. Do we have an understanding? Elias stood, crossing to where Cassian waited by the window. Up close, the Alpha was even more imposing, taller, broader, radiating a power that made Elias's Omega instincts scream at him to submit. But Elias had never been good at following his instincts. He held out his hand. We have an understanding. Cassian took his hand, and the moment their skin touched, Elias felt it. A jolt of something electric, something that made his breath catch and his heart race. From the way Cassian's pupils dilated, he felt it too. One more thing, Cassian said, not releasing Elias's hand. This arrangement works both ways. You're not my prisoner, Elias. You're my partner in this deception. That means I need to be able to trust you, and you need to be able to trust me. Can you do that? Elias thought about it, really thought about it. Then, surprising himself, he nodded. I can try. That's all I ask, Cassian said, and finally released his hand. As Elias watched the commander leave his study, he realized something that should have terrified him but instead felt almost like hope. This arrangement was either going to save them both or destroy them completely. There would be no middle ground. The first test of their arrangement came 3 days later. Absolutely not, Elias said, staring at the formal robes laid out on his bed. They were exquisite, silk in deep sapphire blue, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that marked him as an Omega of high status. They were also a declaration of ownership, designed to complement the black and crimson of Cassian's formal military attire. Mrs. Helena looked apologetic. The commander requests your presence at tonight's imperial gala. It's the first major social event of the season, and the emperor himself will be there. Of course he will, Elias muttered. This was it, the moment when their private arrangement became public spectacle. And I'm expected to parade around as Commander Blackthorn's newly acquired Omega? You're expected to accompany him as his partner, Mrs. Helena corrected gently. There's a difference, young master. Was there? Elias wasn't sure anymore. But he'd made an agreement, and whatever else he was, Elias Ashford kept his word. So he bathed, allowed the estate's styling team to tame his silver hair into something presentable, and donned the robes that marked him as Cassian's. When he descended the main staircase that evening, Cassian was waiting in the foyer, and the sight of him made Elias's steps falter. The commander wore his formal dress uniform, black wool with crimson accents, gold braiding across the shoulders, metals glinting on his chest. His hair was pulled back completely, revealing the sharp planes of his face and those intense amber eyes. He looked like a prince from a storybook, dangerous and beautiful and entirely too compelling. You clean up well, Cassian said, and there was warmth in his voice that Elias hadn't heard before. I could say the same, Elias replied, descending the last few steps, though I feel ridiculous in these robes. You look. Cassian paused, and something flickered in his expression. Perfect, like you belong here. Before Elias could respond, Cassian offered his arm. Shall we? The carriage is waiting. The imperial gala was held at the palace, in the grand ballroom that legends said could hold 1,000 people without feeling crowded. Tonight, it seemed to be testing that limit. Nobles in their finest, military officers in dress uniforms, and Omegas in robes of every color created a kaleidoscope of wealth and power. And every eye turned to them when they entered. Elias felt Cassian tense beside him, though the commander's expression remained perfectly neutral. A server appeared with glasses of wine, and Cassian handed one to Elias before taking his own. Remember? Cassian murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. We're partners in this. If anyone makes you uncomfortable, you tell me immediately. And you'll do what? Challenge them to a duel? Elias asked, only half joking. If necessary, Cassian replied, and Elias realized with a shock that he was completely serious. The evening became a blur of introductions and barely veiled scrutiny. Nobles congratulated Cassian on his acquisition, their words polite but their eyes calculating. Other alphas eyed Elias with expressions ranging from envy to outright hunger. The Omegas, for their part, seemed divided. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with resentment that he'd captured the attention of the Empire's most eligible alpha. Through it all, Cassian remained at his side, a steady presence that Elias found himself leaning on more than he'd expected. The commander's hand at the small of his back was proprietary, yes, but also protective. When one particularly drunk alpha tried to get too close, Cassian's growl was low and menacing enough to send the man scurrying away. You didn't have to do that, Elias said. I can handle myself. I know you can, Cassian replied. But you shouldn't have to. Then the Emperor arrived. Emperor Hadrian IV was in his 60s, a powerfully built alpha whose presence commanded instant silence. He swept into the ballroom with his entourage, and everyone bowed. Even Cassian, though Elias noticed the commander's bow was respectful rather than subservient. Commander Blackthorn. The Emperor's voice boomed across the space. I hear you've finally taken an Omega. Come, present him to me. There was no refusing a direct command from the Emperor. Cassian's hand tightened briefly on Elias's back. A warning or reassurance? Elias wasn't sure, before guiding him forward. Up close, Emperor Hadrian was even more intimidating. His hair was steel gray, his eyes sharp and assessing. He studied Elias with the expression of someone evaluating a purchase. So this is Lord Ashford's son, the Emperor said. I remember your father from court, boy. Brilliant man, terrible judgment. Elias kept his expression neutral, though anger simmered in his chest. Yes, your majesty. Cassian, you paid quite a sum for this one. I hope he's worth it. He is, your majesty, Cassian said firmly. Elias is not only beautiful but brilliant. He's been working on solutions to the Meridian paradox. The Emperor's eyebrows rose. Has he now? Perhaps you should introduce him to the royal astronomer. We could use fresh perspectives on that problem. I would be honored, your majesty, Elias said, seeing an opportunity. If he could actually work with the royal astronomer. See that you do, Blackthorn, the Emperor said, then lowered his voice. And see that you bond him properly. An unbonded Omega in your household raises questions about your commitment to tradition. I understand, your majesty, Cassian said, his tone carefully neutral. As they moved away from the Emperor, Elias whispered, He expects you to bond me. He expects a lot of things, Cassian replied. That doesn't mean I'll comply. But Elias could see the tension in the commander's jaw, the way his hand had tightened into a fist at his side. The Emperor's words weren't a suggestion, they were an order. And Cassian Blackthorn, for all his power, was still a subject of the crown. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. They danced. Cassian was surprisingly graceful for someone so large, and made small talk with various nobles. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were performing on a stage, with the Emperor watching from the wings, waiting for them to misstep. It wasn't until they were back in the carriage, heading home to Blackthorn Manor, that either of them spoke honestly. I'm sorry, Cassian said quietly. I knew there would be pressure, but I didn't expect him to be so direct about bonding. It's not your fault, Elias said, though he felt hollow inside. This is the world we live in. It doesn't have to be, Cassian said fiercely. The Empire's laws on Omegas are archaic. They need to change. And how do you propose we change them? Elias asked bitterly. You're the Emperor's commander, not a revolutionary. Cassian looked at him then, really looked at him, and Elias saw something in those amber eyes that made his breath catch. Maybe I need to be both. Over the following weeks, a strange routine developed. In public, they played their parts perfectly, the devoted Alpha and his brilliant Omega. Cassian escorted Elias to university lectures and observatory sessions, standing proudly beside him as Elias presented his research. The royal astronomer, a kindly old beta named Dr. Cornelius, was delighted to have Elias's help and didn't seem to care about his Omega status. In private, they were something else. Not quite friends, not quite enemies. They shared meals and discussed everything from politics to philosophy. Cassian began teaching Elias about military strategy, and Elias taught Cassian advanced mathematics. Sometimes, late at night, they would find themselves in one of their studies, working on separate projects but enjoying the company. Elias told himself he was simply making the best of his situation, that the flutter in his chest when Cassian smiled at him was just relief at having a better life than he'd expected, that the way he'd started anticipating their evening conversations was just intellectual stimulation. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. The truth hit him one evening when Cassian returned from a military campaign. 3 weeks of absence that had left the manor feeling empty and cold. Elias heard the carriage arrive and found himself running, down the stairs to meet him in the foyer. Cassian looked exhausted, his uniform dusty, a healing cut across his cheekbone. But when he saw Elias, his entire face transformed. "You're back," Elias said, breathless, and realized too late how eager he sounded. "I'm back," Cassian confirmed. And then, so quietly that Elias almost missed it, "I missed you." 3 words. Simple words. But they crashed through all of Elias's carefully constructed defenses like a battering ram through paper walls. "I missed you too," Elias admitted, and saw something fierce and bright kindle in Cassian's eyes. They stood there in the foyer, staff bustling around them, just looking at each other. And Elias realized with terrifying clarity that he was falling for Cassian Blackthorn, the man who had bought him, the man he was supposed to be using while maintaining emotional distance, the man who looked at him like he was the most precious thing in the world. "Elias," Cassian said, taking a step closer, "I need to tell you something." Commander Blackthorn, a young soldier, burst through the manor doors, panting. "Urgent message from the palace. The Emperor requests your immediate presence." The moment shattered. Cassian's expression shifted back to the controlled commander, though Elias saw frustration flash in his eyes. "I'll be right there." He turned back to Elias. "We'll talk when I return. It's important." "Go," Elias said, trying to ignore the disappointment churning in his gut. The Emperor waits for no one. But as he watched Cassian leave again, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just slipped through his fingers. He had no idea how right he was. Cassian returned just after midnight, and Elias knew immediately that something was wrong. The commander's face was pale, his movements stiff, and when he entered the library where Elias had been waiting, his amber eyes were filled with something that looked like despair. "What happened?" Elias asked, setting aside his book. Cassian poured himself a drink, whiskey neat, and downed it in one swallow before answering. "The Emperor has given me an ultimatum." Dread pooled in Elias's stomach. "What kind of ultimatum?" "There's a faction at court," Cassian began, his voice tight. "Nobles who believe I've grown too powerful. They've been whispering in the Emperor's ear, suggesting that an unbonded alpha in such a high position is unreliable, potentially dangerous." "That's ridiculous," Elias said. "You've served the Empire faithfully for years." "Faithfully, yes, but not traditionally." Cassian poured another drink but didn't drink it, just stared into the amber liquid. "The Emperor has given me 2 months. Either I formally bond you with all the traditional ceremonies and public displays, or, Elias prompted when Cassian fell silent. "Or I resign my commission and marry an Omega from the list of candidates the Emperor's advisors have selected. Nobles' daughters, all of them, politically useful matches." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. "He's forcing you to choose between your career and your freedom." "He's forcing me to choose between my duty to the Empire and my promises to you," Cassian corrected, finally meeting Elias's eyes. "I told you I would never bond you without your consent. I meant it. If you say no, I'll resign." I'll find another path. And lose everything you've worked for, Elias said. Your position, your influence, your ability to protect the people who depend on you. Yes, Cassian said simply. Elias stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the gardens were dark, the moonlight casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. His mind raced through the implications. If Cassian resigned, he would lose not just his position but his political power. The reforms he'd been quietly pushing for, better treatment of Omegas in military service, laws protecting servants from abuse, all of it would stall or die completely. And Elias? Without Cassian's protection, he would be vulnerable again. His father's creditors would resurface. Other alphas would see an unclaimed Omega formerly attached to a disgraced commander and circle like sharks. But more than that, and this was the thought that made his heart ache, he would lose Cassian. The conversations, the companionship, the way the commander looked at him like he was worth something beyond his designation. There has to be another option, Elias said desperately. If there is, I haven't found it. Cassian set down his glass and moved to stand beside Elias at the window. I've thought about this from every angle, consulted with allies at court. The Emperor has made up his mind. He sees an unbonded alpha as a liability in the current political climate. They stood in silence for a long moment, both staring out at the darkness. What does bonding actually entail? Elias asked finally. I know the public aspects, but the private ones. Cassian's jaw tightened. A bond is formed through the exchange of marks during an Omega's heat. The alpha bites at the juncture of neck and shoulder, and the Omega returns the mark. It creates a permanent psychic connection, a link that allows the alpha to sense the Omega's emotions and vice versa. He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. Intimate, permanent, not something to be entered into lightly. And if we bonded, it would be real, Elias said. Not just for show. Yes, once formed, a bond cannot be broken except by death. Elias turned to look at Cassian. Really look at him. The commander was staring out at the gardens, his profile sharp in the moonlight. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something that made him seem less like an untouchable warrior and more like a man caught in an impossible situation. If we did this, Elias said carefully, if we bonded, what would you want from me? Really? Cassian turned to face him fully. The truth. Always. I would want. Cassian paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I would want what we have now. Your companionship. Your brilliant mind challenging mine. The way you argue with me about military tactics over dinner and explain celestial mechanics at midnight. I would want to come home to you after campaigns and know that you're safe. I would want. He stopped abruptly, and Elias saw his hands clench into fists. What? Elias pressed. What else would you want? I would want you to choose me, Cassian said quietly. Not because you have to, not because it's the practical option, but because you want to, because you feel even a fraction of what I feel for you. Elias's breath caught. And what do you feel for me? Cassian took a step closer, and suddenly the space between them felt charged, electric. I've commanded armies, Elias. I've stared down enemy generals and negotiated with hostile kingdoms. But I've never been as terrified as I am right now, standing here with you, about to say something that could ruin everything. Say it, Elias whispered. I love you. The words came out rough, almost angry. I've loved you since that first moment in the marketplace when you stood on that platform with your head held high, refusing to let them break you. I've loved you through every dinner conversation, every late-night study session, every time you look at me like I'm not just a commander or an alpha but a man. I bought you to save you, yes, but somewhere along the way you saved me too. Elias felt his world tilt on its axis. All those weeks of telling himself that his growing feelings were just gratitude, just friendship, just anything but love. And here was Cassian, laying his heart bare with the same courage he brought to battlefields. I'm afraid, Elias admitted. I'm afraid that if we bond, I'll lose myself, that I'll become just another Omega who exists in his alpha's shadow. Then we make sure that doesn't happen, Cassian said fiercely. Your name stays on your research, You continue your work at the observatory. You speak your mind even when you disagree with me, especially when you disagree with me. The bond doesn't have to be a cage, Elias. It can be a partnership. Can it? Elias asked. In this empire with these laws? We'll change them, Cassian said. Together. I told you once that maybe I needed to be both a commander and a revolutionary. I meant it. With you by my side, truly by my side as my bonded mate, we would have even more power to push for reform. The Emperor's bonded Omega speaking out for Omega rights? Publishing research under his own name? That would be revolutionary all on its own. Elias wanted to believe him. God, how he wanted to believe. But fear held him back. Fear of losing his autonomy, fear of being hurt, fear of wanting something so much that its loss would destroy him. I need time, Elias said, to think about this. Pain flickered across Cassian's face, but he nodded. Of course, you have 2 months before the Emperor's deadline. Take all the time you need. But as Cassian turned to leave, Elias found himself reaching out, catching the commander's hand. Cassian froze, looking back at him with those amber eyes full of hope and fear and love. I need you to know, Elias said, his voice shaking slightly, that I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of how much I want this, of how much I want you. Cassian's fingers tightened around his. Is that such a terrible thing? When you've spent your whole life being told that wanting anything for yourself is selfish. Yes. Understanding dawned in Cassian's eyes. Your father. He taught you that your needs don't matter. He taught me that Omegas who reach above their station get crushed, Elias said bitterly. That the only way to survive was to make myself small, useful, invisible. You could never be invisible, Cassian said softly. You shine too bright. And then, slowly, giving Elias every opportunity to pull away, Cassian raised their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to Elias's knuckles. It was chaste, respectful, but the tenderness of it made Elias's chest ache. Take your time, Cassian repeated. I'll be here, whatever you decide. After he left, Elias stood alone in the library, his hands still tingling where Cassian's lips had touched his skin. 2 months. He had 2 months to decide if he was brave enough to take the leap, to choose love over fear. 3 weeks later, Elias woke up knowing that his time for deciding had just run out. His heat was coming. He'd felt it building for days. The restlessness, the increased sensitivity, the way his body seemed to hum with need whenever Cassian was near. He tried to ignore it, had doubled his suppressant doses, but his body had other plans. By noon, he was feverish. By evening, he was desperate. Mrs. Helena found him curled up in his bed, shaking and miserable, and immediately sent for the doctor. Dr. Wilhelm, the estate's physician, examined him and confirmed what Elias already knew. Your heat has triggered despite the suppressants, the doctor said gravely. Given your history of suppressant use, I suspect your body is compensating. You have 2 options. Ride it out alone, which will be extremely painful and potentially dangerous, or bond with an alpha, Elias finished, his voice hoarse. With Commander Blackthorn, specifically, Dr. Wilhelm clarified. Your bodies have been in close proximity for months. Your Omega is already imprinting on his alpha pheromones. Anyone else would be inadvisable. Where is the commander? Elias managed to ask. He's been called away on urgent military business, Mrs. Helena said gently. But we've sent word. He'll return as quickly as he can. The next hours were a blur of fever and frustration. Elias tried to manage it alone, locked in his rooms with cold compresses and suppressants that did nothing but make him nauseous. His Omega instincts screamed for an alpha, for his alpha specifically. His body recognized what his mind had been denying. Cassian was his. Sometime around midnight, through the haze of heat fever, he heard commotion downstairs. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. His door bursting open. Cassian stood in the doorway, still in his travel-stained uniform, breathing hard like he'd run the entire way from wherever he'd been. His amber eyes found Elias immediately, and Elias watched them darken with concern and something deeper, more primal. "Everyone out," Cassian ordered, his voice rough. "Now." Mrs. Helena and Dr. Wilhelm fled, closing the door behind them. Cassian crossed to the bed in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside it. "Elias," he breathed, and his hand came up to touch Elias's forehead, checking his temperature. The touch sent sparks of need racing through Elias's body. "You came back," Elias managed. "Of course I came back. Do you think anything could keep me away when you need me?" Cassian's other hand clenched in the sheets, like he was physically restraining himself from touching Elias more. "Tell me what you need." "You," Elias whispered, too far gone to pretend anymore. "I need you." Cassian closed his eyes, and Elias saw the war playing out across his face. Desire versus restraint, instinct versus honor. "Elias, you're in heat. You're not thinking clearly." "I won't. I can't take advantage." "I love you," Elias said, and watched Cassian's eyes snap open in shock. "I've been trying not to. I've been so afraid of losing myself, of becoming just another Omega in an Alpha's shadow. But you're right, it doesn't have to be that way. We can be partners. We can change things together." "You're sure?" Cassian's voice was strained. "Because once we do this, there's no going back. The bond is permanent." "I'm sure," Elias said, and realized it was true. The heat had burned away his fears, leaving only clarity. "I choose you, Cassian Blackthorn. Not because I have to, because I want to." Something broke in Cassian's control. He surged forward, capturing Elias's lips in a kiss that was equal parts desperate and reverent. Elias moaned into it, his hands fisting in Cassian's uniform, pulling him closer. "I need you to say it one more time," Cassian murmured against his lips. "When you're clearer. In the morning, when the fever breaks, I need you to tell me again that this is what you want." "I will," Elias promised. "I'll tell you every day for the rest of our lives if you need me to." Cassian made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and buried his face in Elias's neck, breathing in his scent. "I love you. God. I love you so much it terrifies me." "Then show me," Elias whispered, and Cassian did. The bonding was everything Elias had feared and everything he'd secretly hoped for. Intense, overwhelming, but also tender in a way he hadn't expected. Cassian took his time, whispering reassurances, making sure Elias was comfortable even as the heat threatened to consume them both. When Cassian's teeth finally sank into the juncture of his neck and shoulder, Elias felt the bond snap into place like a lock finding its key. Suddenly, he could sense Cassian's emotions. Love so fierce it made him gasp, protectiveness like armor around his heart, desire that matched his own. And when Elias returned the bite, marking Cassian as his, he felt the Alpha's shock and joy flood through their new connection. "You marked me," Cassian's thought echoed through the bond, wonder coloring every word. "You're mine too," Elias replied, and felt Cassian's love wrap around him like a warm blanket. They fell asleep tangled together, the bond humming contentedly between them, two people who had found in each other exactly what they'd been missing. The morning after their bonding, Elias woke to find Cassian watching him with an expression of such tenderness that it made his chest ache. "Hi," Elias said softly. "Hi," Cassian replied, his hand coming up to trace the fresh bonding mark on Elias's neck with gentle fingers. "How do you feel?" Elias took inventory. The heat had broken, leaving him exhausted but clear-headed. The bond thrummed in the back of his mind, a constant awareness of Cassian's presence and emotions. And despite everything, despite all his fears, he felt happy. "I feel good," he said, then caught Cassian's hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. "I meant what I said last night. All of it." Relief and joy flooded through the bond. "Thank God," Cassian murmured, pulling Elias closer. "I was afraid you might regret it in the morning." "The only thing I regret," Elias said, "is that it took me so long to admit how I felt." They spent the morning in bed, learning the nuances of their new bond, talking about everything and nothing. But eventually reality intruded. The Emperor will want to see proof of the bonding, Cassian said reluctantly. There will be a formal ceremony. Announcements to the court. Let them announce, Elias said, surprising himself with his conviction. But we do this on our terms. I'm not going to be paraded around like a trophy, Cassian. If we're going to be bonded, we're going to be partners in everything. A slow smile spread across Cassian's face. What did you have in mind? Over the next week, they planned. Not just a bonding ceremony, but a statement. Elias would attend the formal presentation to the court, yes, but he would do so as more than just Cassian's Omega. He would be announced as the commander's research partner, his political advisor, his equal in all but military rank. The nobles would hate it. The traditionalists would be scandalized. Cassian couldn't wait. The ceremony was held in the imperial throne room, with the entire court in attendance. Elias wore robes of silver and black, colors that complemented Cassian's uniform but marked him as his own person rather than simply an accessory. Around his neck, the bonding mark was visible, but so was the pendant Cassian had given him that morning. A star made of platinum, representing Elias's work in astronomy. When the Emperor called them forward, they walked together, side by side rather than with Elias trailing behind. Elias could hear the whispers, could feel the shocked stares, but he kept his head high. Commander Blackthorn, the Emperor said, his voice booming through the hall. You have fulfilled your duty and bonded in Omega. The Empire congratulates you. Thank you, Your Majesty, Cassian said, his voice formal but firm. However, I must clarify something. Elias is not simply my bonded Omega. He is my partner in every sense. His research has already contributed to the Royal Observatory's work, and I have consulted him on several military strategy questions. His insights have been invaluable. The throne room erupted in murmurs. An Omega being publicly acknowledged for intellectual contributions? Unheard of. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. Careful, Commander. You border on impropriety. With respect, Your Majesty, Elias heard himself say, and felt Cassian's surprise and pride through the bond. The only impropriety is the Empire's continued refusal to recognize Omega contributions. I am not the first Omega to possess intelligence or capability. I'm simply the first to have an Alpha willing to acknowledge it publicly. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias could feel Cassian's tension, could sense the Emperor's anger, but he'd committed now. Might as well follow through. The laws restricting Omega education and employment are outdated. Elias continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart. They waste the potential of half the population. If the Empire truly wants to remain strong, it needs to utilize all its resources, including those of us who happen to be Omegas. You dare lecture your Emperor on policy? Hadrian's voice was dangerous. But before things could escalate, a voice from the crowd spoke up. The Omega makes a valid point, Your Majesty. Everyone turned. It was Duke Calderon, one of the oldest and most respected nobles in the Empire, an Alpha whose opinion carried significant weight. My own Omega daughter has been privately tutored in economics, the Duke continued. Her insights into trade policy have saved my duchy thousands of gold crowns. Yet she cannot hold a formal position because of her designation. Perhaps it is time we reconsidered these restrictions. More voices joined in, some in agreement, others in opposition. The court descended into heated debate, and Elias realized with shock that they just started something that couldn't be easily stopped. The Emperor raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. These are weighty matters that require consideration. Commander Blackthorn, your Omega has given us much to think about. We will take his words under advisement. It wasn't a victory exactly, but it wasn't a defeat either. As they left the throne room, Elias felt Cassian's pride and love through the bond. That was magnificent, Cassian thought to him. That was terrifying, Elias replied, but he was smiling. That was revolutionary, Cassian corrected, and pulled him close for a kiss that scandalized half the nobles watching. The Imperial University's new Omega Studies program graduated its first class on a bright spring morning. Elias stood at the podium, looking out at the 20 Omegas who had fought for the right to be there, and felt pride swell in his chest. 2 years ago, he began, I stood in a marketplace being sold to settle debts. Today, I stand here as the head of this university's astronomy department, and as proof that designation does not determine destiny. The changes hadn't come easily. There had been battles in court, debates in parliament, protests from traditionalists. But slowly, piece by piece, they'd dismantled the old restrictions. Omegas could now own property, pursue education, hold professional positions. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight, but it was progress. Cassian stood at the back of the hall, watching his mate with undisguised admiration. Through their bond, Elias could feel his love, his pride, his absolute certainty that they'd made the right choice. After the ceremony, they walked through the university gardens together, hands linked. The Emperor asked me to consider a diplomatic position, Cassian said. Ambassador to the Northern Kingdoms. Elias looked at him in surprise. What did you tell him? That I'd need to discuss it with my partner first, Cassian replied with a smile. Our partnership, remember? Our partnership, Elias agreed, and felt that now familiar warmth bloom in his chest. What do you think about it? I think, Cassian said, pulling him close, that wherever we go, whatever we do, as long as we're together, I'll be happy. Elias laughed and kissed him, there in the gardens, not caring who saw. You've gotten sentimental in your old age, Commander. I prefer to think of it as wisdom, Cassian replied. Besides, you love it. I love you, Elias corrected. The sentimentality is just a bonus. They stood there in the spring sunshine, bonded and in love, two people who had found freedom in each other and used it to change an empire. Their story had started in chains, but it had become a revolution, and they were just getting started.